Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Good morning to everybody and welcome to Columbia Reunion. I'm Lisa Rosen-Match and I have the honor to be the Dean of the Columbia School of General Studies, and I have the honor to introduce our faculty speaker for today, Dean and Professor James Colgrove. James Colgrove is Professor of Sociomedical Sciences at the Mailman School of Public Health with an appointment in the Department of History at Columbia. He is also, starting this year, the new Dean of the Postbaccalaureate Premedical program at Columbia School of General Studies. Dean Colgrove is an accomplished scholar, teacher, administrator, and author. His scholarship has examined the relationship between individual rights and the collective well-being and the social, political, and legal processes through which public health policies have been mediated in American history. Dean Colgrove has written several books on public health, including State of Immunity, The Politics of Vaccination in 20th Century America, published by University of California Press. And his most recent book was Epidemic City, The Politics of Public Health in New York, which I think he may need to rewrite again, given all the events of the last few months. That was published by the Russell Sage Foundation. Dean Colgrove has also been published in the New England Journal of Medicine, the American Journal of Public Health, Health Affairs, the Bulletin of the History of Medicine, and the Journal of Law, Medicine, and Ethics. And as I'm sure some of you know who've come on this call today, he is an award-winning and beloved teacher, very popular for his undergraduate course, Social History of American Public Health. As I mentioned, he joined us at GS in the last year. I have had the pleasure of working with Dean Colgrove now for 8 years as I in my previous position at Mailman, and he is a dear colleague and a treasured person and human being, and I am so delighted now to introduce to you Professor Colgrove.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Dean Rosen-Match. I'm going to invite everyone if you go to view options at the top of your screen, if you select side by side, which should be the last option on your menu, that will enable you to see the slide unobstructed. So thank you all for being here, and thank you again, Lisa, for that introduction. It has been such a joy to become part of the GS family over the last year. I teach courses for MPH students and undergraduates, and one of the things that I study and teach about is the history of public health and medicine. History can be a tool for reflection and analysis. History can help us make sense of what's going on in the world around us in the present day. We are all in history. The world that we live in looks the way it looks because of history, and certainly the events of the last few weeks, I think, have demonstrated for us the way that our country continues to be shaped by its deep and long history of racism. There are many very nice quotes about the presence of history in our lives. One of my favorite quotes that I often begin my classes with comes from one of my favorite authors, James Baldwin, who wrote the following in 1965 in Ebony magazine. He wrote, "History does not refer merely or even principally to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. It could scarcely be otherwise, since it is to history that we owe our frames of reference, our identities, and our aspirations." Baldwin wrote this essay a couple of years after he wrote one of his most famous books, The Fire Next Time, which I think a lot of people have been going back to and thinking about these days amid the mass protests against racism and police brutality. He was writing specifically about our country's failure to confront its long history of racism, but I think this quote is really applicable to any historical phenomenon that you could name. And so history isn't just a bunch of stuff that happened a long time ago. When we look at history, we're looking at the world that we live in now. So this past spring, I taught my undergraduate course on the history of public health, and more than ever, my students and I found that the world was our classroom. The challenges presented by COVID-19 are unprecedented in the lives of most of the people who are alive today, but they are not new historically. Quite the contrary. For most of our country's history, frightening diseases that disrupted people's lives were the norm. So what I'd like to do in my session today is to situate the current epidemic in its historical context and to provide some perspective on our current challenges, particularly some of the political issues that this epidemic is raising. So COVID-19 presents many scientific challenges, obviously, challenges around the development of a vaccine and effective treatments and diagnostic assays, but it also raises questions that are fundamentally political in nature. And in particular, two questions that I'd like to take up today. How should we take collective action to promote public health? And what are the rights and obligations of government to protect people from disease? These aren't scientific questions. They're not really even empirical questions at all. They are legal and ethical in nature, and certainly political. One of the things I'm going to be arguing in my talk today is that public health is an inherently political enterprise. And by that, I don't mean political in the kind of narrow partisan sense of left versus right, but in the more general sense of contestations among competing interests in society and how power is distributed. So don't get me wrong, public health is absolutely a science-based discipline, but there are many situations like the one that we've been in this past spring where there is scientific uncertainty and the science is inconclusive. Who holds power always matters, especially when the science is contested. So the plan for today's session, I'd like to go in three parts. I'll begin by giving some general context and background for what life was like when epidemics were common. Next, I'll talk about government action to limit the spread of epidemics. And in the last part of the talk, I'll look at where we are now and take some stock. Please ask me questions as I go along. I have left time for questions at the end, but very happy to take questions throughout. You can use the chat box. If you open up your participants list, you should find a little raise your hand icon if you want to go on mic and ask me a question. I welcome your questions and comments throughout. So actually, to begin with, if I could ask you all to go to your chat box, could you all please type in, where are you joining from? What city are you logging on to this call today? I'm just curious where people are. Yonkers, okay. Bethesda, Weehawken, St. Louis, Dublin, Long Island, Upper West Side, Boston, Jackson, Mississippi. Wow, good, excellent. It's great to see people from so far away. Switzerland, wow, even some international folks. Thank you for joining from other time zones. Virginia to Hell's Kitchen. This is great to see. One of the reasons that I asked this question is that you all likely had different experiences with COVID-19 depending on where you were this spring. My talk today is going to focus primarily on the US, but I do hope that all of you who have been in other countries this spring will bring in your experiences and share any comments that you have. So until about 100 years ago, that is, for the majority of our country's history, contagious diseases were part of people's everyday lives in a way that's sort of hard to wrap our brains around today. So today, the leading causes of sickness and death are chronic, non-infectious diseases like heart disease and cancer. But in the 19th century and well into the 20th century, the leading causes of death were all microbial. Does anyone know, can anyone type into the chat, what was the leading cause of death in the 19th century? I'll give you a hint, it's not smallpox, although that is in the title of my talk. Excellent, Beata. It was indeed tuberculosis. TB is an airborne disease caused by a bacillus. TB was a disease that most people had some firsthand experience with in the 19th century among their families, their friends, and their loved ones. It figures very prominently in cultural production of the era, as a plot point in books and plays, and depicted in paintings like this one by the great painter Cristobal Rojas, depicting the grief over the death of a loved one. Rojas, incidentally, died himself of tuberculosis just a few years after he painted this scene. This is a scene of poverty, as you may be able to tell if you look closely here. And one of the consistent themes in the history that I'm going to be talking about today in the history of disease is the very close connection between disease and deprivation, and between disease and poverty. TB was an endemic disease, meaning that it was a disease that was sort of always among us at consistent levels, circulating throughout the population. So other childhood diseases like diphtheria and whooping cough and diarrheal diseases were endemic and were responsible for most of the sickness and death in the 19th century. And these diseases were really sort of part of the fabric of life. In addition to endemic diseases, there were epidemic diseases, those that might be absent for periods of time and then would suddenly reemerge and spread very rapidly with high numbers of cases and high numbers of deaths. And epidemic diseases were particularly frightening to people because of their seeming randomness and unpredictability, their deadliness. The distinction between endemic and epidemic is not fixed and unchanging. An epidemic disease can become endemic and vice versa. And in fact, the WHO this spring has said that coronavirus may become an endemic disease. That is, it may establish itself in the world so that we have it sort of continually circulating among the population at lower levels. An example of an epidemic disease was cholera. The US experienced several very severe epidemics of cholera in the 19th century. And when cholera first struck the US in the 1830s, Americans experienced it as a kind of terrifying, implacable monster sweeping through society and leaving death and destruction in its path. And if you read newspapers and magazines of the 19th century, you'll see many depictions like this one with death or disease depicted as a kind of ghastly, rampaging figure. Similar imagery, this is from another epidemic, shows a sense of sort of helplessness and fear. So the family is cowering on the ground while disease personified looms in the air. In the skeleton's hand, you see the sword of pestilence. This is a rhetorical trope that would have been recognizable to 19th century audiences. In this illustration, you may notice that death seems to be wafting ashore from a ship that is anchored out in the harbor, and I'm going to say more about that in a moment. An example of the kind of severe devastation and disruption and fear that epidemics could cause was the Great Yellow Fever epidemic of 1878. And this is a representative sample of some of the press coverage from that epidemic. To our contemporary eyes, the journalistic language in these accounts seems very kind of melodramatic, a wail of death, agonizing appeals. The monster malady sweeps its victims from earth with increased violence, fever horrors. this language, I think, really reflects the sense of terror and helplessness that people felt. Yellow fever is a hemorrhagic disease that causes a really horrible, prolonged death with profuse bleeding. It was a very gruesome death, somewhat similar to Ebola, which is another viral hemorrhagic disease. The 1878 epidemic was one of the most devastating epidemics of the 19th century. It broke out in New Orleans, which was the busiest port in the South at the time. And it spread rapidly upward through the Mississippi Valley, eventually stretching far into the upper Midwest and the mid-Atlantic. In the Mississippi Valley alone, there were an estimated 20,000 deaths. The oldest response to an epidemic was not a governmental one. It wasn't really even a collective one, but an individual one, and that was to flee. So if an epidemic struck your town in the 19th century, if you could, the first thing that you did was you got the hell out of there. About 1/5 of the population of New Orleans fled the city. The ability to escape disease and to protect oneself in this way was, of course, conditioned by socioeconomic status. So if you were a wealthy person with a summer home, you could load up your coach and go off into the country, and that was much easier for you than if you didn't have those things. There was actually a fascinating article about a month ago in the Times. Some of you may have seen, they studied where New Yorkers went to this spring who left the city. And if anybody recalls that, do people remember where was the #1 destination of New Yorkers who left the city to get away from coronavirus? Or want to take a guess? It was indeed Florida, Miami to be more specific. So if you're gonna flee somewhere, you might as well go to where the weather's nice. So the poor could flee, of course, but obviously they faced much more perilous and uncertain conditions if they did. The people who were most likely to be left behind in an epidemic were the people who were very poor, who had nowhere to go and didn't have the means to flee. So this was the scene in Memphis, which was by far the worst hit city in the country during the 1878 epidemic. More than half of Memphis's 50,000 residents fled the city. Of those who stayed, more than a quarter died. In the days before a robust national system for the distribution of food, the danger of starvation was a real risk in an epidemic. So epidemics like yellow fever exposed societal divisions and exposed societal inequities. Disease has always affected rich and poor unequally. So today we understand that yellow fever is a mosquito-borne disease, but that was not known at the time. And one of the things I want to make clear here is that contemporary knowledge of viruses and bacteria didn't emerge until the end of the 19th century. And for most of the century, people believed that diseases arose spontaneously from filthy environments. Many people believed that disease was God's punishment for wickedness and impiety. Some people believed that diseases were contagious and could spread from person to person in a way sort of similar to what we understand now, but that was not a majority belief. One of the things that made epidemics so frightening in this era was their unknowability. So people were really trying to make sense of something in their lives that they didn't understand. One of the most primal reactions when people are confronted with an epidemic is to look for a cause and to assign responsibility or to assign blame. And often they blamed people who they perceived as other. So epidemics also have often exposed deep strains of xenophobia, the fear of others. So this is a political cartoon from a New York newspaper. And you can see here the home of the microbes. These are Irish microbes. So the signifiers of Irish identity are all there. Sligo is a county in Ireland, O'Casey, Shamrock. This was a time of very heavy Irish immigration into the US. And the stereotype of the Irish immigrant was drunken, dirty, lazy, and stupid. And as a natural consequence of all these other characteristics, prone to illness. Immigrant groups were often portrayed in very crude and racist media as carriers of disease and vectors for the spread of epidemics. Similarly, this was a cartoon from the 1890s, one of New York's microbes. So the person is being conflated with the microbe. This person's occupation is a rag picker. He makes his living going through cast-off cloth in the trash and then reselling it to tailors. This was a stereotypical occupation for Eastern European Jewish immigrants. And this illustration is trafficking in the crude stereotype of what upper-class New Yorkers imagined an Eastern European Jew looked like. So there's been an excellent question in the chat box. Are you bundling race and enslavement with socioeconomic status? No, quite the contrary. Enslaved African-American people experienced unique risks and had a unique experience independent and over above socioeconomic status. So there is overlap between those two things, but the condition of slavery absolutely brought with it a whole set of risks and dangers that were not faced by the poor who were not enslaved. So, you know, being poor in the 19th century across the board was pretty crappy. If you were a poor white laborer, conditions were really bad. But the institution of slavery in its fundamental brutality and inhumanity presented a whole set of health conditions that were quite different from other people of low socioeconomic status. So thank you for asking that question. Those two things were not coterminous at all. So I've talked about some of the individual reactions and responses to illness in this era. I'd like now to turn to look at the role of government efforts to protect health. So are there any questions on anything I've said so far? Anything anybody wants to put into the chat, or if you want to raise your hand. All right, so I'd like to now look at the role of government. And here I have a poll, which I'm hoping I am able to bring up successfully. So what I'd like you all to do now is to take a moment to think about all the measures that were adopted in your jurisdiction to prevent the spread of coronavirus. So I'm talking about things like stay-at-home orders and business closures and compulsory mask wearing in public. And I'd like to ask you all this question. So I hope you can see the poll there. The measures that were adopted in my area to control the spread of coronavirus were they do you think they were too strict? Do you think they were not strict enough? Or do you think that they were about right? Are still voting. Interesting results, which I'll show in a second. Okay, last chance, going once, going twice. All right, so I'll display the results now. So this is interesting. About over half of people thought the measures were about right. A little shy of half thought that they were not strict enough. The idea that they were too strict was not common at all. So I'll say more about this at the end. The polling on this, generally showed overwhelming support, and with most people being strongly supportive of very strict measures. So your results are fairly consistent with the results overall. But as a couple of you have pointed out in the chat, very different in very different jurisdictions, and wide variation within jurisdictions within the US is one of the things that I'm going to talk about in a moment. So the responsibility, the government responsibility to limit the spread of epidemic diseases is one of the oldest recognized functions of government in our political system. In a way, it is as important as some of the better recognized functions like collecting taxes and building roads and national defense. Governments, mostly state and local, very little on the national level, implemented a variety of restrictions on the movement of people and goods to limit the spread of disease. Even though the idea of contagion was not widely accepted, it had long been observed that the spread of disease seemed to map onto the movement of goods and people. One of the oldest public interventions was the quarantine of ships. The term quarantine encompasses a variety of interventions. It can look like different things. Technically, quarantine refers to the separation of people who have been exposed to a disease but who are not yet sick, and who in fact may never become sick. The term over time has often been used very loosely to refer to a variety of measures that limit the movement of people and goods in order to halt the spread of disease. So this spring, we saw widespread disagreement about whether interrupting the chain of coronavirus transmission justified the economic damage and the limitations on individual freedom of movement that disease control measures can impose. Imagine having those debates at a time when most people didn't even accept the basic premise that a disease could spread from person to person. You'll get a sense of how controversial quarantine measures often were. So the way this worked is that a ship carrying passengers or goods or both would pull into a harbor. A doctor, one or more doctors, would board the ship to inspect the people and the goods. And if evidence of disease was found among the passengers, depending on the disease, either an individual or an entire ship might be taken to a quarantine hospital or might be held way out in the harbor. As you can imagine, quarantine was quite unpopular with many people, both merchants and passengers alike. And I should say this could also happen in the context of other forms of transportation like steamships and trains. Another type of quarantine was home quarantine, which was implemented for many of the commonly occurring endemic diseases that I talked about earlier. So if you walked through a 19th century city or town, even if there wasn't an epidemic going on, you might see placards like these on the homes of your neighbors. So when a doctor reported a case of infectious disease to a local health authority, someone would visit the home and stick a placard on it. So the residents of that home who had been exposed but were not sick were asked not to leave the home, and no one was permitted to enter. So disease was very much a public matter. It was visible to all. And notice here, this is by order of the Board of Health. So local and state boards of health, government agencies specifically empowered to enforce health codes began to be created in the middle of the 19th century. So I'm getting a note that blue lines are appearing on my slides. Do people see blue lines? I see a whole bunch of blue lines. I have no idea where they came from. What should I do about this? Should I maybe stop my screen share and then start it again? Let me try that.
Sure. It doesn't block the content, but yeah, I don't know what that was.
That's super weird. Are they gone now?
Gone.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for that. Thank you for that tech support, Aviva. All right. So quarantine. So quarantine keeps people in. Quarantine can also keep people out. Citizens sometimes took matters into their own hands to protect themselves rather than relying on government, particularly in rural areas that were less likely to be served by a local or a state board of health. So remember all those people that you saw fleeing New Orleans a few minutes ago? Well, sometimes when they got to the next town over, they found that the people there didn't want them. So this scene is showing a practice that was known as shotgun quarantine. So this people on the left there are fleeing their town where presumably there's a yellow fever outbreak. And the people in the next town over have taken up arms to keep them from entering. This practice, I think, raises some very disturbing questions around the legitimacy of citizen action in our society. The idea of an armed citizenry is, of course, very central to our political ethos. And there is a very shameful tradition in this country, I hardly need to tell you, of armed militias taking the law into their own hands to enact racist violence against African Americans, although not only African Americans, and that's certainly one thing that this journalistic illustration makes me think of. A final type of quarantine that I want to talk briefly about is sanitary cordon. So this is a kind of geographically based quarantine in which a defined area, like a city block or an entire neighborhood, was placed under lockdown with no one allowed in or out. When Wuhan, China was placed under quarantine in January, that was an example of a sanitary cordon, the largest, certainly in modern history, certainly one of the largest ever in history. As you can imagine, this type of quarantine is very difficult to implement on a large scale. Logistically, it's just very hard to control the movements of that many people, and the larger the area, the harder it is. So during a worldwide epidemic of bubonic plague in 1899 and 1900, the Hawaiian government placed Honolulu's Chinatown under sanitary cordon after cases of plague were diagnosed there. And the problems with this kind of quarantine, I think, are fairly obvious. The conditions can very rapidly deteriorate for the people who are inside. Some of the most compelling images from this past spring, images that introduced much of the world to coronavirus, were the kind of blurry cell phone videos that people took of life under lockdown in Wuhan, China, with empty store shelves that had been completely cleared of goods and overcrowded clinics where desperate patients were seeking care. A last very important disease control measure that I want to briefly mention was specific to one disease, and that was smallpox. So smallpox was a terrifying disease that had really gruesome symptoms, a high fatality rate. Smallpox was a unique disease in this era because it was the only disease that could be reliably prevented. The smallpox vaccine was the first vaccine ever developed. It was the only vaccine we had for a very long time. And many states and localities made it compulsory. So it was in the 1850s that states first started requiring that school kids had to get vaccinated as a condition of attending school. And the way that you checked somebody's vaccination status, which you see the headmaster doing in this picture, was that you looked for a scar. So unlike today's vaccines, the smallpox vaccine was a very crude vaccine. It was usually given on the upper arm, and it left a scar. So if you wanted to know if somebody was protected against smallpox, you asked them to roll up their sleeve. We don't have smallpox in the world anymore, thank goodness. It's the only human disease that has been successfully eradicated from the globe. And the way it was eradicated was through a massive, very aggressive global vaccination campaign in the 1960s and 1970s. And one of the challenging policy questions that I think is coming down the road for us, I think, with respect to COVID-19 is, if a vaccine is developed, what kind of legal requirements for vaccination, if any, will be put in place? As you, I'm sure you all know, to attend Columbia, you have to show proof that you have been vaccinated against measles. I think it is possible, even likely, that universities and other institutions might start requiring people to be vaccinated against coronavirus if and when we ever get a vaccine. So quarantine laws and enactments and compulsory vaccination laws sometimes ended up in courts. They provoked legal challenges from people who saw them as a violation of their individual liberty. And these questions raised very interesting, sometimes very tough legal and ethical questions about how to balance the government's responsibility to control the spread of disease with the responsibility to protect individual rights and to not limit people's freedoms unnecessarily or unjustly. Historically, courts have been quite deferential to public health authority. Not always, but usually courts have upheld quarantines and other compulsory disease control measures. The constitutional basis for these measures is the police powers. So police powers, certainly the subject of a lot of debate and controversy today. This is talking about something that's much broader than police in terms of the police that we are all thinking about now. The police powers refers generically to the power of state and local governments to safeguard the health, welfare, and safety of citizens. A very large body of jurisprudence during the 19th century upheld a wide variety of compulsory health measures, things like closing unsanitary businesses, regulating the location of slaughterhouses, enactment of quarantines, and compulsory vaccination laws. So any questions on anything I said so far? How are we doing on time? Doing okay on time. Okay, so let's shift now and look at where we are today. So over the course of the 20th century, the terrifying diseases that once defined our civic life in this country gradually receded from view. And this was due to a variety of factors: improvements in overall standard of living, particularly more of the population having consistent access to clean drinking water and sewage disposal, people being less likely to be malnourished, led to a decline over many decades in the infectious killers that had once been the leading causes of death. Advances in medical science, new vaccines and treatments gave us new mastery over microbes. Quarantines mostly fell into disuse, and as a country, we grew pretty complacent. And we thought our battles against contagion were safely confined to the past. And of course, as we have seen, that is very much not the case. So the first of the novel coronaviruses emerged in the new millennium. SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome, appeared in the winter and spring of 2003. Hard-hit cities in Asia took very drastic steps to limit the spread of the disease, including mandatory home and hospital quarantine, travel restrictions, strict limits on public gatherings, mandatory masks in public, and successfully controlled the SARS outbreak. The US was almost completely spared SARS. We had almost no cases for reasons that remain unclear to this day. And SARS disappeared after that outbreak, and we haven't seen it since. We had a very severe outbreak of H1N1 flu in 2009, some of you may recall. We had MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, another coronavirus in 2012. And public health experts continued to warn that it was only a matter of time, that it was a matter of when, not if, that a terrible, deadly pandemic would bring the world to its knees. And that moment is now upon us. So where does that leave us today? We are nearing 2 million cases of COVID-19 in the US. Deaths from COVID-19 have surpassed, well surpassed 100,000, around 108,000 now. more than the combined number of Americans who were killed in the Vietnam and Korean wars combined. Global cases of COVID have now surpassed 6 million. The business closings and mass quarantines and stay-at-home orders and the other drastic public health measures that were taken seem to have successfully curtailed the epidemic for now. But this success has come at a terrible economic cost, including some 20 million jobs lost. And those burdens are disproportionately borne by people who are already disadvantaged, low-wage workers in the service economy without paid sick leave or good health insurance. A lot of what my students and I saw this spring looked very familiar to us as historians. So as with virtually any disease that you can name, rates of COVID cases and deaths disproportionately affected the poor, illustrating once again the long-standing association between socioeconomic status and adverse health outcomes, and that's a pattern that has been seen throughout our history. New York City historically has been characterized by extremes of wealth and poverty, and any map in this city showing the distribution of disease shows patterns that are somewhat similar to this. The long legacy of racism in our country is apparent in the statistics showing the disproportionate burden of coronavirus in African Americans. Nationwide, African Americans are around twice as likely to die from COVID-19 as whites. And in some places, the disparities are even more extreme. So this is a small sampling of some of the state level data from a couple of months ago. And you can see that in some cases, the death rate is quadruple or even more than quintuple the rates of whites. This is another way of looking at that data that shows just the grossly disproportionate burden that African Americans are far more likely to die from COVID at rates that far exceed their proportion in the population. The effect of racism is independent of the effects of poverty, and this is to BKK's excellent question earlier. Racism itself exerts an independent risk factor in sort of complex ways that have been widely studied, but are not to this time fully understood. Certainly a question in the chat box about the effect on elderly in nursing homes. That data has been really appalling. There, it's the confluence of factors between the elderly having being more biologically affected and just the epidemiological nature of a nursing home, a sort of closed environment, put a lot of people who are immune compromised together in the same place. This spring, we saw widespread incidents of anti-Asian stigma and discrimination and even violence directed towards people of Asian descent, in part because of the pandering of cowardly and racist politicians who evoked fears of a Chinese virus for cynical political gain. We saw demonstrators take to the streets in several states, including California, Idaho, Wisconsin, and Michigan, to protest stay-at-home orders and mandatory business closings. I mentioned earlier, the opinion polls actually showed very, very high levels of public support for these measures, generally in the range of 80 to 90%, which was quite consistent with the data from this group that showed that most people thought that they were appropriate or should even have been more strict. A very small but very vocal, often militant minority protested them as unconstitutional, which certainly had no legal or constitutional basis. These protests, of course, were inflected with a very deep anti-government sentiment that characterizes the current moment in this country. So as always, people understand and interpret epidemics in light of what they believe about the world more generally. So if you fear and mistrust immigrants, then you're probably going to believe that they are responsible for all sorts of bad things that happen in the world, including the spread of disease. If you fear and mistrust your government, you're going to understand disease control measures as tyrannical. So as countries of the world and as states of the US take sort of tentative steps towards reopening their economies and their social spaces, they are confronting many unknowns. Will a second severe wave of COVID-19 sweep the globe this winter, as happened 100 years ago in the 1918-19 flu pandemic? Will infection with coronavirus result in lasting immunity? Many other questions. So those are scientific unknowns, but we're also facing, I think, many political unknowns. What lessons will we as a society take away from this epidemic, and will this epidemic lead to lasting social and political change? And I think those are questions not dissimilar to the ones that many people are asking in the response to the crisis that has now gripped our country, the massive outpourings of protests over racism and police brutality in the wake of the deaths of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and countless others whose names we don't know, but who are very much there. Will this be a turning point for our country? Will it lead to lasting change? And what will our country and our world look like on the other side? With that, I will leave leave us with this question, and take your questions. I actually wanted to quickly address a couple of the questions that people submitted in advance. People had a chance to submit questions when they made their reservations. Some really excellent questions were raised. One was about building support for public health. The question was basically, how do we build support for public health, which is so critical. It, in a way, I think is the million-dollar question. You know, public health has a big problem, which is that it is invisible when it works well. When public health does what it does, people aren't aware of it. I often say to my students, you probably did not wake up this morning and say, gosh, I'm so happy I'm not going to get typhoid today. You should say that. And when you say that, you should thank public health, because it is because of public health that we are all free from diseases. One question I think of as going forward is, will this crisis convince people that we need to build our public health infrastructure? And the other question that was asked was about combating misinformation, an incredibly critical challenge in this era of alternative facts and the post era. And I welcome, I welcome the comments of everyone. There's a science to effective public communication and combating misinformation that draws on psychology and other disciplines, but it's quite challenging. And in a way, I feel like we almost have gone back to the mid-19th century, to the era when people didn't agree on what causes diseases. We are in an unprecedented era of science denial. So those, I think, are real questions. So I'm looking now at some of the other questions in the chat box. Literature about pandemics. I'm so glad that you mentioned Laurie Garrett's book. I love The Coming Plague. And in fact, I had a slide of The Coming Plague, which I took out because my slides were too long. Laurie Garrett, a journalist who wrote a book back in the 90s called The Coming Plague, in which she took stock of Ebola and Lassa fever and AIDS and Legionnaire's disease and all of the new and emerging pathogens. It's an excellent book, well worth reading. Laurie Garrett is still around. She lives in Brooklyn. She is having her I Told You So moment. Lots of good fiction. Gosh, I'd love to just sit here and talk about my favorite books on this. Aviva, can I post my recommendations and reading list? So April has asked, is the rush to reopen a dangerous idea? Boy, that's not a softball question. I think I think clearly there is a danger. There absolutely is a risk. The question is, what is the level of risk? Again, what we're looking at is this very complicated calculus between the risk of disease and the economic damage, which is real. I mean, the economic damage that has been done to people is dreadful. And so, you know, everyone is looking at the need to reopen the economy versus the need to prevent the spread of disease. You know, fortunately, there's a quite rigorous list of metrics that jurisdictions are looking at in terms of deciding when to reopen, and they're monitoring all of those indicators closely so that if the metrics seem to be ticking back up, they can recalibrate. So, you know, people are doing this very carefully, but absolutely there are risks to reopening. What do we have? Do you think we have celebrities stepping up for COVID-19 vaccination if we ever have one? Boy, that makes me so nervous. Yeah, I mean, it's a longstanding tradition in public health that draws upon advertising, right? Is that you want role models. You want to do what you see admired public figures are doing. I worry that in the current environment of kind of hyperpartisanship, I worry about anything that doesn't sort of put the scientists front and center. You know, the WHO and the CDC have issued best practices guidelines on communicating publicly about science, and their recommendation generally is you lead with the scientists, because mostly, in spite of all the current science denial, mostly people trust scientists. The data are quite clear that people trust their primary care provider. They trust frontline doctors. So I think rather than celebrities, I would favor public service announcements featuring your PCP, your primary care provider. Looking at other questions. Lauren has asked an excellent question about public health funding. You're right, the public health system has been chronically underfunded for years, criminally underfunded, I think. How is it possible to build and advocate for things many people in power may not deem necessary? I mean, to the point I made earlier, it's so hard to convince people to support a system that is invisible when it works well. And so, you know, there have been examples in the past of epidemics, sort of a crisis being a window of opportunity. You know, it's not clear that will be the case. I can tell you that many people up at the Mailman School, my faculty colleagues, are thinking a lot about precisely this question. There was a previous question about Detroit refugees, migrants. Aviva, can you maybe remind me of what that question is?
Sure, let me just scroll up one second. So there was a question about Detroit referring to clean water and multi-generation families, which, as we know, also that would be relevant to New York as well, but vulnerable populations, migrants, refugees, and you know, how to handle that during this situation.
Yeah, I mean, the crisis of COVID cannot be disentangled from the history of racism and the history of inequality in this country. And one of the things that epidemics do is they sort of expose existing injustices and inequities. I mean, the Flint crisis sort of burst onto the scene several years ago and has not gone away, and sort of the shameful neglect of cities, of communities of color, I think has continued. So you know, this public health crisis is very closely related to other longstanding public health crises. I'm looking now. So interesting question about the adverse effects of COVID-19 on education. Boy, lots of people at Columbia looking at that right now. I mean, as someone who taught an online class for several years, I can tell you that, you know, online education can can have benefits in making material available to people who might not have access to it otherwise. But you know, there's something very special and very necessary about the human connection that I'm not sure is fully met by that. I think that's one of the key questions right now. I do know Michael Osterholm's work. He's a very, very smart, very rigorous researcher and scholar. He is one of the people I have mentioned who has been warning for a very long time, so that we would face this. So thank you, Sienna, for that comment. How can we, so Peter, hi Peter, how can we better address the mental health issues in addition to the physical? Gosh, there's so much in that question. You know, there's, again, the historical, very long-standing separation, that sort of artificial separation between physical and mental health, in spite of all that we know about how much those two things are so closely connected. Again, that disconnect is very deeply historically rooted. We as a country, I think, have made baby steps in the last couple of decades towards bringing mental health issues more to the forefront and in creating parity in terms of, for example, insurance coverage and what insurance will pay for mental health care vis-a-vis what it will pay for physical health care, but so much farther to go on that score. Really, I mean, the trauma, I think, that is coming out of this and the confluence of so many other traumas, all of these related traumas, I think is a really critically important issue right now. Aviva, I see we're at 12:27. I worry that I'm standing between people at their lunch, which I never like to do. So I would love to look at these questions and when I have time to think about them, and I'm happy to respond. Can we send those out to folks?
Sure, that would be great. Yes, our Zoom captured all of these questions, so we're happy to send a follow-up email to all the guests with some thoughts from Dean Colgrove and reading recommendations and all the great information he doesn't mind putting together. Yeah, happy to send that out.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to say thank you to Dean Professor James Colgrove. This was an amazing presentation lecture that I'm sure everybody learned so much about. If you're a student at Columbia, definitely consider taking Professor Colgrove's course in the future. And just want to thank you again for putting this together.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure spending time with you, and I'm so happy and blessed to be part of the GS community. So thanks for the chance to be with all of you today.
And we are blessed for sure. I just want to invite everyone on the phone, on the virtual presentation here today to join us at 2 o'clock, where we're going to be having a very exciting conversation with a Columbia alum and author of the new book, Marriage Equality from Outlaws to In-Laws, that's published by Yale University Press. And we're going to be getting a preview of that book. So please join us for a conversation with the esteemed author, Christopher Riano. Thanks, and have a good afternoon. We'll hopefully see you at 2.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.